Los Alamos, New Mexico, late 1942. The nascent atomic bomb project, codenamed Manhattan, faced a critical juncture. Early theoretical work suggested two paths to a weapon: enriching uranium-235 from its more abundant isotope, or creating a new, heavier element. The stakes were immediate and existential. Whichever nation first harnessed this power would dictate the terms of the coming peace, or perhaps the very survival of its adversaries. The scientific community, now militarized, felt the pressure of a global conflict that had already claimed tens of millions of lives. The initial calculations, performed by a small cadre of physicists, pointed to plutonium as a viable alternative to uranium enrichment, a process deemed incredibly difficult and resource-intensive. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's scientific director, tasked a theoretical division under Hans Bethe with exploring the practicalities of plutonium production and weaponization. Within this group, a quiet, methodical physicist named Dr. Rudolf Peierls, alongside Otto Frisch, had already made foundational contributions to the understanding of critical mass for uranium. Now, their attention shifted to the untested transuranic element. Early assumptions about plutonium's properties were based on extrapolations from lighter elements and limited cyclotron-produced samples. The expectation was that plutonium-239, the fissile isotope, would behave similarly to uranium-235, readily fissioning when struck by neutrons and releasing a cascade of energy. The chemical separation of plutonium from irradiated uranium, while complex, was believed to be achievable on an industrial scale, particularly after Glenn Seaborg's team at the University of California, Berkeley, had successfully isolated microgram quantities. This early success, however, masked a deeper, more insidious problem. The initial design for a plutonium bomb envisioned a gun-type assembly where two subcritical masses of plutonium would be rapidly fired into each other to achieve criticality. This method, conceptually straightforward, relied on the plutonium remaining relatively pure, specifically free from isotopes that would spontaneously fission. The theoretical division's work involved meticulously calculating neutron cross-sections, decay rates, and the probabilities of various nuclear reactions within a reactor environment. Production logs from early experimental piles, like the Chicago Pile 1, began to provide real-world data on the neutron flux and isotopic composition of irradiated uranium. These logs, though preliminary, hinted at complexities beyond initial models. As the theoretical models grew more sophisticated, incorporating data from progressively larger experimental reactors, a troubling picture began to emerge. The intense neutron bombardment required to produce significant quantities of plutonium-239 inevitably led to the formation of plutonium-240. This isotope, while not fissile in the same way as plutonium-239, possessed a significantly higher spontaneous fission rate. Damage reports from early irradiation experiments, while not directly related to weapons, underscored the extreme conditions within the reactor core, conditions that fostered the creation of undesirable isotopes. Peierls' team, using increasingly refined calculations, determined that even a small percentage of plutonium-240 would dramatically increase the spontaneous neutron background. This background, if sufficiently high, would cause the plutonium core to pre-detonate, fizzling rather than producing a full-yield explosion. The gun-type assembly, designed for speed but not absolute precision, would be too slow to overcome this premature chain reaction. The critical assembly time for a gun-type device was calculated to be in the order of milliseconds, while the spontaneous fissions from plutonium-240 would initiate a chain reaction in microseconds. The margin of error was simply non-existent. The theoretical properties of element 94, christened plutonium, presented a formidable challenge. Its very existence was a triumph of prediction, an extrapolation from the periodic table, yet its practical isolation seemed to defy conventional chemical wisdom. The initial calculations, based on its likely position in the actinide series, suggested a chemical behavior so similar to uranium that separation by traditional means would be extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible on an industrial scale within the compressed wartime timeline. Early theoretical work, primarily by Glenn Seaborg and his team at Berkeley, projected that plutonium would exhibit multiple oxidation states, a characteristic that could, in theory, be exploited for separation. However, the sheer quantity of uranium required to produce even microscopic amounts of plutonium through neutron capture meant that any separation process would have to contend with an overwhelming excess of the parent material. The chemical signatures of the two elements, particularly their ionic radii and complexing tendencies, were anticipated to be too close for efficient fractional crystallization or precipitation. Laboratory experiments, initially conducted with minute quantities of plutonium-239 produced in cyclotrons, confirmed the complexity. Milligram scale tests, meticulously documented, showed that while plutonium could indeed exist in different oxidation states, manipulating these states selectively in the presence of massive amounts of uranium and fission products was a monumental task. The yields from these initial separations were often below 50%, an unacceptable loss rate for a material whose production was already so arduous and expensive. The quantitative hurdle was immense. To produce a weapon-grade quantity of plutonium, estimated at several kilograms, would necessitate processing tons of irradiated uranium. A separation efficiency of even 90% would still leave significant amounts of uranium contamination, and more critically, substantial quantities of highly radioactive fission products that would interfere with the plutonium's nuclear properties and render handling extremely hazardous. The implication was clear. A new, highly selective chemical process, unlike anything previously conceived, was absolutely essential. The initial reports from Berkeley, detailing the chemical similarities and the anticipated difficulties, circulated among the project leadership, casting a shadow over the plutonium pathway to the bomb. The engineering scale-up from milligram to kilogram quantities, already a leap of faith, now seemed to demand a fundamental reinvention of chemical engineering itself under immense time pressure. The quiet reflection among the physicists was that while the nuclear physics of plutonium were compelling, its chemical isolation might prove to be the project's Achilles heel. The initial designs for a plutonium production facility, emerging from the theoretical work at Berkeley and Chicago, centered on a chemical extraction methodology. The fundamental challenge lay in separating a few grams of newly created element 94 from hundreds of kilograms of highly radioactive uranium fuel, a process that would require repeated dissolution and precipitation cycles. The irradiated uranium slugs, once removed from the graphite pile, would be intensely hot, both thermally and radioactively, necessitating remote handling and substantial shielding. Early blueprints envisioned massive concrete canyons, each hundreds of feet long, designed to house a linear series of reaction vessels. Within these shielded cells, the fuel slugs would first be dissolved in nitric acid, creating a highly corrosive and radioactive soup. This initial solution, a complex mixture of uranium, fission products, and the nascent plutonium, presented an unprecedented chemical engineering problem. The proposed method, known as the bismuth phosphate process, relied on the co-precipitation of plutonium with bismuth phosphate. This technique, developed by Glenn Seaborg and his team, exploited the distinct oxidation states of plutonium. Plutonium in its +4 oxidation state would precipitate with bismuth phosphate, while uranium and many fission products remaining in solution could be decanted away. However, the process was not a single, clean separation. It required multiple cycles of oxidation and reduction, dissolving and reprecipitating to achieve even a modest degree of purity. Each cycle would reduce the overall volume of material, but concentrate the radioactivity, demanding ever more robust shielding and increasingly sophisticated remote manipulation equipment. The waste streams, voluminous and highly active, posed a disposal problem of monumental scale. Production logs from the pilot plant at Oak Ridge X10 indicated that even at a relatively small scale, the chemical separation was inefficient and hazardous. To produce a single gram of plutonium, thousands of liters of highly acidic, intensely radioactive waste were generated, requiring storage in massive underground tanks. The yield of plutonium from the irradiated uranium was consistently below theoretical expectations, often around 50 to 60% per pass, necessitating further reprocessing of the already processed material. The sheer volume of material to be processed for a weapon-grade quantity of plutonium, estimated at several kilograms, translated into an industrial undertaking of staggering proportions. The scale-up from laboratory experiments to a facility capable of handling tons of intensely radioactive material was a leap into the unknown, fraught with engineering and safety challenges that had no precedent. The chemical method, while conceptually sound, demanded an infrastructure and a level of operational control that strained the limits of wartime industrial capability. Chicago, late 1942. The theoretical physicists at the Metallurgical Laboratory, a clandestine operation housed beneath Stagg Field, began the arduous task of modeling the behavior of a new element. Their work focused on plutonium-239, an isotope predicted to be fissile, a potential keystone in the design of an atomic weapon. The challenge was not merely to confirm its fissile nature, but to understand the complexities of its production within a nuclear reactor, specifically the isotopic contaminants that would inevitably arise. The initial calculations, performed by a small team led by Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, centered on the neutron capture cross-sections of uranium-238. This process, essential for plutonium formation, also presented a critical problem: subsequent neutron captures by the newly formed plutonium-239. These secondary reactions would lead to the creation of plutonium-240, an isotope with profoundly different nuclear properties. The presence of plutonium-240, even in small quantities, was understood to be a significant impediment to weapon design. Data from preliminary pile experiments, though limited, provided crucial input for these theoretical models. The absorption rates of thermal neutrons by uranium metal, measured in gram-moles per hour, indicated a non-zero probability for multiple neutron captures within the proposed reactor environment. This meant that as plutonium-239 accumulated, it would itself become a target for further neutron bombardment, generating the unwanted plutonium-240. The implications of these calculations were stark. A weapon-grade core required plutonium with an exceptionally low percentage of plutonium-240, ideally less than 0.5%. The theoretical models, however, predicted that any reactor operating long enough to produce militarily significant quantities of plutonium-239 would simultaneously generate plutonium-240 at levels far exceeding this threshold. The longer the irradiation time, the higher the concentration of the contaminant. The difficulty lay in the neutron economy. For every 10,000 atoms of uranium-238 transmuted into plutonium-239, the calculations suggested that perhaps 50 to 100 of these newly formed plutonium-239 atoms would capture another neutron, becoming plutonium-240. This ratio, while seemingly small, was critical. Plutonium-240, with its higher spontaneous fission rate, would act as a pre-detonator, causing a fizzle rather than a full-yield explosion. The theoretical physicists, working with slide rules and early mechanical calculators, generated tables detailing the predicted isotopic composition of reactor-produced plutonium as a function of irradiation time and neutron flux. These tables, several dozen pages thick, became the bedrock of subsequent engineering decisions. They indicated that to achieve the desired purity, the uranium fuel slugs would need to be removed from the reactor after an impractically short period, requiring a continuous and rapid reprocessing cycle. The analysis of these theoretical yields, cross-referenced with anticipated reactor power levels and fuel throughputs, painted a grim picture for rapid weapon deployment. The sheer volume of material that would need to be processed to obtain even a single kilogram of weapons-grade plutonium, given the calculated contamination rates, was staggering. The numbers indicated that conventional chemical separation techniques, already complex, would be further burdened by the need to handle highly radioactive, freshly irradiated fuel. The physicists grappled with the concept of burnup, the extent to which the uranium fuel was irradiated before removal. High burnup meant more plutonium-239, but also proportionally more plutonium-240. Low burnup meant purer plutonium, but at the cost of vastly increased processing requirements and a much slower overall production rate. The quantitative trade-offs were severe, pushing against the urgent demands of wartime. The conclusion, derived from these meticulous calculations, was unequivocal. Isolating pure plutonium-239, free from problematic levels of plutonium-240, would be an exceedingly difficult and time-consuming endeavor. The physics dictated a fundamental limitation. Chicago, late 1943. The early optimism surrounding plutonium's promise as an alternative fissile material began to fray under the relentless scrutiny of theoretical physicists. Their calculations, initially focused on the pure, weaponizable Pu-239, now extended to the complex realities of its production within a nuclear reactor. The challenge was not merely creating plutonium, but creating plutonium of sufficient purity for a weapon. The initial models for reactor operation, while robust for energy generation, had not fully accounted for the subtle yet critical isotopic shifts that would occur over extended irradiation times. As uranium-238 absorbed neutrons and transmuted into neptunium-239, which then decayed into plutonium-239, a parallel process was also underway. Some of the newly formed plutonium-239 would inevitably absorb another neutron. This secondary absorption event, though statistically less probable than the initial transmutation, was not negligible over the vast quantities of uranium required and the extended periods of neutron flux within a production reactor. The result of this additional neutron capture was the creation of plutonium-240, an isotope with profoundly different nuclear properties. Plutonium-240, unlike its more stable cousin Pu-239, exhibited a significantly higher rate of spontaneous fission. This inherent instability meant that any weapon containing a substantial fraction of Pu-240 would suffer from a phenomenon known as pre-detonation. The weapon would likely fizzle, releasing only a fraction of its potential energy, or even fail to detonate entirely before the carefully engineered compression could achieve a critical state. The theoretical threshold for unacceptable pre-detonation was determined to be remarkably low, a mere few percent of Pu-240 contamination. Above this threshold, the probability of a successful, high-yield explosion plummeted. The physicists, working with slide rules and early calculating machines, began to model the kinetics of neutron absorption within proposed reactor designs, factoring in neutron flux, fuel residence time, and cross-sections for both Pu-239 and Pu-240 formation. Their projections, derived from fundamental nuclear physics principles and confirmed by early experimental data from smaller piles, painted a stark picture. To produce plutonium with a Pu-240 content below the critical few percent, the uranium fuel would have to be removed from the reactor after an impractically short irradiation period. This would drastically reduce the overall plutonium yield per unit of uranium processed, making the entire enterprise inefficient and astronomically expensive. Conversely, allowing the fuel to remain in the reactor long enough to generate economically viable quantities of Pu-239 would inevitably lead to an accumulation of Pu-240 far exceeding the acceptable limit. The more plutonium-239 was produced, the more plutonium-240 would also be formed, a direct consequence of the neutron-rich environment. This was not a problem that could be engineered away with better reactor design or more precise control rods. It was an intrinsic nuclear reality. The chemical separation processes, designed to isolate plutonium from irradiated uranium, were also incapable of distinguishing between plutonium isotopes. Once Pu-239 and Pu-240 were formed, they were chemically identical. Isotopic separation, a monumental task even for lighter elements like uranium, was deemed impossible for the heavy radioactive plutonium isotopes with their minute mass difference, especially on the industrial scale required for bomb production. The implications were profound. The elegant, simple implosion design envisioned for a pure Pu-239 weapon would not work for reactor-grade plutonium. The inherent neutron background from Pu-240, spontaneous fission, would trigger the chain reaction too early, before the core could be fully compressed. A different, far more complex weapon design would be necessary to overcome this fundamental limitation. The physicists had inadvertently identified a critical flaw in the initial plutonium weaponization strategy. Los Alamos, late 1943. The early optimism surrounding plutonium's potential as a bomb fuel began to curdle under the weight of experimental data. Initial calculations, based on uranium-238's capture of a neutron and subsequent beta decays, had painted a picture of a relatively clean, fissile isotope, plutonium-239. This was the prize, the element that promised a compact, powerful weapon, perhaps even more potent than a uranium device. However, the reality emerging from the nascent Hanford reactors was far more complex. Samples of reactor-bred plutonium, arriving in minute quantities, revealed an unwelcome companion. Spectrographic analysis and neutron emission measurements confirmed the presence of plutonium-240, an isotope created when plutonium-239 absorbed an additional neutron instead of fissioning. This seemingly minor isotopic impurity carried profound implications for weapon design. The critical issue with plutonium-240 was its high spontaneous fission rate. Unlike plutonium-239, which required an external neutron source to initiate a chain reaction, plutonium-240 constantly emitted neutrons through its own internal decay processes. Early measurements indicated a spontaneous fission rate of approximately 460,000 fissions per second per kilogram, a number that dwarfed the rate of plutonium-239 by several orders of magnitude. This inherent neutron background rendered the elegant gun-type assembly method, perfected for uranium-235, utterly unworkable for reactor-grade plutonium. In a gun-type device, two subcritical masses of fissile material are rapidly brought together to form a supercritical configuration. The speed of assembly is paramount. It must occur in a time shorter than the interval between spontaneous fissions from the weapon's own material. With plutonium-240 present, the neutron flux was simply too high. Before the two plutonium hemispheres could fully unite and achieve optimal supercriticality, a stray neutron from a plutonium-240 atom would almost certainly initiate a premature chain reaction. This pre-detonation would result in a fizzle, a mere explosion of conventional explosives scattering the plutonium without achieving a significant nuclear yield. The weapon would disassemble itself before reaching its full potential, a catastrophic failure of design. The maximum assembly time for a successful gun-type plutonium device, considering the plutonium-240 contamination, was calculated to be on the order of a few microseconds. The fastest conventional gun mechanisms, even those utilizing high explosives, operated on a timescale of milliseconds. This fundamental disparity, a factor of 1,000, presented an insurmountable barrier for the gun-type design with reactor-grade plutonium. The implications were stark. The entire production pipeline, from the massive reactors at Hanford, designed to transmute uranium into plutonium, to the chemical separation plants, was yielding a material that could not be used in the simplest, most reliable bomb design. The carefully planned strategy for two distinct weapon paths, uranium gun type and plutonium gun type had effectively been reduced to one. The plutonium bomb, if it were to succeed, would require an entirely different, far more complex, and as yet undeveloped assembly mechanism. Los Alamos, late 1943. The core problem, as Oppenheimer now understood it, transcended mere engineering. It was a fundamental constraint of physics and chemistry. The pre-detonation of a gun-type plutonium device, the fizzle, was not an acceptable risk. The estimated yield of such a fizzle, perhaps a few hundred tons of TNT equivalent, while significant, would not achieve the psychological or strategic impact required of the project. A weapon that failed to deliver its full potential was, in essence, a failure of the entire enterprise. The critical mass for plutonium-239, even if perfectly pure, was already small, making assembly at supercritical velocity a challenge. The presence of plutonium-240, however, drastically reduced the time window available for assembly. Plutonium-240, an unavoidable byproduct of reactor irradiation, had a significantly higher spontaneous fission rate than plutonium-239. This meant that as the plutonium pit was brought together in a gun-type assembly, there would inevitably be a burst of neutrons from the Pu-240 before the full critical mass was achieved. This premature neutron flux would initiate a chain reaction too early, blowing the core apart before it could reach its optimal density and full explosive yield. Initial calculations by Seth Nettermeyer and others at Los Alamos indicated that the gun-type method, while viable for uranium-235, simply would not work for reactor-produced plutonium. The spontaneous fission rate of plutonium from the X-10 graphite reactor at Oak Ridge and later from Hanford was too high. For a gun-type device, the two subcritical masses of plutonium would need to be brought together at a speed exceeding 3,000 feet per second to overcome the pre-detonation probability. This velocity was beyond the practical limits of conventional artillery technology, which formed the basis of the gun-type design. The alternative, therefore, had to be radically different. Instead of firing one subcritical mass into another, the plutonium itself would be compressed. This compression would increase its density, thereby reducing the mean free path for neutrons and making the material supercritical. The concept was known as implosion. The challenge was immense: to achieve a perfectly symmetrical compression of a spherical plutonium core using precisely timed, converging shock waves. This was not merely an incremental improvement, it was a complete conceptual pivot. The theoretical work on implosion had begun in earnest at Los Alamos, largely driven by Nettermeyer's early, somewhat abstract proposals. His initial sketches showed a hollow sphere of fissile material surrounded by high explosives. When these explosives detonated simultaneously, they would create an inward-moving shockwave, compressing the sphere. The difficulty lay in ensuring absolute uniformity of this inward pressure. Any asymmetry would deform the plutonium core, leading to an inefficient or failed detonation. This requirement for precision was orders of magnitude greater than anything previously attempted in ordnance design. The implosion device would require a complex lens system of high explosives, carefully shaped and arranged to focus the detonation wave. These explosive lenses, a novel concept, would transform a divergent detonation wave into a convergent one, much like optical lenses focus light. The timing of these detonations had to be synchronized to within nanoseconds across the entire surface of the sphere. This demanded new types of detonators and an unprecedented level of understanding of shockwave physics. The production of these specialized explosive lenses, each requiring precise machining and careful assembly, would become a major industrial undertaking in itself. The plutonium core itself would need to be fabricated into a hollow sphere, or pit. To allow for maximum compression, this hollow design maximized the amount of work the implosion shockwave could perform on the material, pushing I to densities far exceeding its normal state. The density increase was the key to reducing the critical mass and achieving a rapid, efficient chain reaction. The engineering implications were staggering. Material science, explosive chemistry, and precision manufacturing all had to advance simultaneously and at an accelerated pace. The gun-type design, for all its complexity, relied on established principles. Implosion was venturing into largely uncharted territory. The understanding of plutonium's isotopic composition, particularly the persistent presence of Pu-240, fundamentally reshaped the Manhattan Project's trajectory. Initial theoretical models, based on extrapolated cross-sections and decay rates, had not fully accounted for the neutron capture probability during prolonged irradiation in a reactor. This oversight meant that any plutonium produced in sufficient quantities for a weapon would inevitably contain a significant fraction of the faster fissioning Pu-240, rendering a gun-type assembly impossible due to premature detonation. The calculations, refined by teams at Los Alamos and Chicago, confirmed that the spontaneous fission rate of Pu-240 would release a burst of neutrons before the critical mass could be fully assembled, preventing a sustained chain reaction. This scientific revelation, emerging from months of meticulous data analysis and theoretical refinement, mandated a complete reevaluation of the weapon design. The implosion method, previously considered a secondary, more complex option, now became the sole viable path for a plutonium device. This shift required an unprecedented engineering effort, demanding precise synchronization of explosive lenses to compress the plutonium core uniformly, a challenge far exceeding the mechanical simplicity of a gun-type mechanism. The metallurgical and chemical teams at Los Alamos faced the immediate task of developing techniques to cast and machine plutonium into spherical shells, a material notoriously difficult to handle due to its toxicity and multiple allotropic phases. Production logs from Hanford, Washington, indicated a steady increase in plutonium output, reaching approximately 6 kilograms per month by late 1944. Each gram, however, carried the inherent burden of its isotopic impurity, a testament to the inescapable laws of nuclear physics. The initial design for a gun-type plutonium bomb, codenamed Thin Man, was formally abandoned in July 1944. A direct consequence of these updated nuclear cross-section measurements. Its cancellation redirected all high-priority efforts towards the Fat Man implosion design, concentrating intellectual and material resources on a single, technically demanding solution. The implosion device necessitated a much smaller critical mass due to the extreme compression, but it also demanded a highly specialized neutron initiator, precisely positioned at the core's center. This initiator, often a polonium-beryllium source, had to release a burst of neutrons at the exact moment of maximum compression, a timing challenge that pushed the boundaries of conventional engineering. The design also required a tamper, typically made of uranium, to reflect neutrons back into the core and increase the efficiency of the fission reaction, further complicating the internal geometry and material selection. The inherent properties of plutonium, specifically the Pu-240 content, therefore dictated an entirely new paradigm for atomic weapon construction. The scientific understanding of its nuclear characteristics had, in effect, narrowed the technological pathway to a single, immensely difficult solution. The shift from a conceptually straightforward gun assembly to the intricate implosion system represented not a choice but a scientific imperative, driven by the immutable laws governing nuclear fission. The Trinity test, scheduled for July 1945, would be the culmination of this forced adaptation, a direct consequence of the plutonium's recalcitrant nature. 180 days remained until the first full-scale test of the implosion device.